She didn't know how long she'd been lying there when the second sun went out. Not a real sun, she understood that much. The Sovereignty's orbital mirror array had been burning since dawn, cooking the ridge with reflected light until the gravel itself cracked. When the strike team punched through it on their way down, the array spun off its axis, and whatever it had been doing to the sky stopped. Now there was just the real sun, lower and colder, and the long shadow of the wrecked Sovereignty Command lander cutting across the valley floor like a blade. Gret lay at the edge of that shadow and did not move. She had tried moving twice. The first time, just after the explosion had slammed her into the rock face, she'd gotten her arms under her and pushed, and something in her lower back had sent a sheet of white fire up through her spine, and she'd gone down face first into the gravel and bitten through the inside of her cheek. The second time was slower and more deliberate. She'd rolled to her side, gotten her elbows under her, and dragged herself 3 feet through the red dust before the pain folded her completely, and she lay still and breathed and watched a line of insects cross the ground 6 inches from her tusks. So not walking, not crawling, possibly not much of anything depending on what that white fire meant. She'd taken inventory the way Sergeant Dravik had taught her, back when the unit was whole and the war was still a war instead of whatever this was. She pressed her fingers across her ribs, 3 broken, maybe 4, but they moved together, no sucking chest wound. Her left arm worked. Her right arm worked slower. Her head hurt in the specific pressing way that meant concussion, not skull fracture. Below the waist was the problem. Her legs responded, both of them. She could flex and point. But when she tried to push weight through them, the white fire came back and she lost several seconds each time. The lander was maybe 400 yards away. It had come down hard on the eastern end of the valley, clipping the ridgeline, and one of its landing struts had punched clean through the hull before shearing off. It was not going anywhere. The drives were cold. Whatever was left of its command crew was either inside or scattered across the half-mile of debris field she could see from here if she turned her head carefully to the right. She turned her head carefully to the right. No movement in the debris field. No movement at the lander. No Sovereignty soldiers limping through the wreckage. No rescue craft descending through the sky. No anything. Just the wind and the insects, and somewhere over the next ridge the distant sound of what might have been artillery or might have been thunder. Gret let her head rest on the gravel and looked at the sky. The rest of the unit, what was left of it by the time they'd reached the valley, had scattered during the lander's crash descent. Myra had gone left, toward the creek gully, covering the retreat of the remaining civilians they'd been shepherding since the Sovereignty advance had pushed them out of Keswick. Vorlin had gone right without a word, which was how Vorlin did most things, and the last she'd seen of him he was climbing the eastern face with a launcher on his back, trying to get an angle on the lander before it could deploy troops. He'd gotten the angle. The launcher had hit something important. The lander had come down. She didn't know if Vorlin was alive. She didn't know if Myra had gotten the civilians clear. She didn't know if any of the 7 soldiers ahead of them in the column, the ones who'd been designated the official forward unit by the Sovereignty's own battlefield assessment, had done anything useful at all, or whether they'd simply kept running the way they'd been running since the 2nd week of the campaign. The official forward unit. She'd watched them receive the resupply drones. She'd watched them get the armor upgrades and the better field rations and the priority medical evacuation. They were officially sanctioned. They existed in the war's record-keeping in a way that Gret's unit did not. Gret's unit had been attached to the column as a supplemental force, unofficial, off-record, expendable in the clinical language of the mission brief. She was beginning to think the mission brief had been accurate. The wind shifted and she smelled burning insulation, and below that, something organic she chose not to think too hard about. The lander's hull groaned once, a long metallic complaint, and then went quiet. She needed to think. She was good at thinking. It was one of the things about her that had annoyed her commanding officers more reliably than almost anything else. She thought when she was supposed to shoot, and she asked questions when she was supposed to march, and she had once famously refused a direct order to advance through a kill zone because she'd done the math on the artillery timing, and the math was wrong. She'd been right and the order had been wrong, and 3 people had still died because part of the unit hadn't waited, and she'd spent a long time afterward not sleeping well. She thought now, the lander was down. If the command crew had transmitted before impact, sovereignty reinforcements could be 6 hours out or 60. There was no way to know. What she could know, the lander's drive core, even cold, stored enough compressed fuel state energy to be extremely dangerous if the crash had compromised its containment vessel. There were protocols for this. She knew the protocols because she'd spent 2 weeks in the sovereignty's own technical manuals, which she'd lifted from a supply cache outside Brennan, reading through the night by lamp light while Vorlin slept, and Myra cleaned her weapons and complained about the smell of the lamp. If the containment vessel was breached, the drive core had perhaps 12 hours before it became the kind of problem that ended discussions. If it wasn't breached, it sat there. If someone rigged the manual override, and she knew exactly where the manual override panel was, 3rd maintenance hatch on the port hull, the little one with the yellow and black striping that the Sovereignty used on all their lander-class vessels, because apparently even aliens found yellow and black useful. Then the drive core could be induced to release its stored energy in a controlled directional event, in the direction of anything parked overhead waiting for a landing site, in the direction of anything descending to collect survivors. She thought about this for a while. 400 yards, on her feet in good conditions, 2 minutes, on her belly dragging her lower half, stopping every 3 feet to breathe through the white fire, she estimated 3 hours minimum. Possibly more. Possibly she would pass out in the debris field and wake up surrounded by Sovereignty soldiers who would have to decide whether it was worth processing an unconscious Orc fighter when the rest of the valley presumably needed sorting. Probably not worth it, she thought. Orcs were not worth much in the Sovereignty's accounting. This had been demonstrated repeatedly over the preceding months in ways she was still processing. The sun moved. The shadow of the lander shifted. She watched it. She had a canteen, half full. She had her sidearm, the compact one she wore on her thigh, and 7 rounds. She had a combat knife. She had a roll of field dressing she hadn't needed yet and now might need extensively. She had a folded photograph in the inner pocket of her jacket, pressed against her sternum, and she did not take it out because she was saving it. The photograph was the thing she was going to look at when she had done everything else. Looking at it now would be admitting she had nothing else to do, and she was not ready to admit that. She began to crawl. The first 100 yards took an hour. She developed a system. Elbows and forearms flat, head down, push with the left leg which hurt less, drag the right. Rest for a count of 30. Push again. The gravel bit through her jacket at the elbows and she bled there, slow and thin, and she watched the bloodstain spread and held that count of 30 and then pushed again. She thought about the unit. The unit had started with 11 soldiers. By the time they'd reached the valley they were 5, and by the time the lander came down they were 3. In between those numbers was a series of events she would write down someday, if writing became available, because the events deserved to be recorded and probably nobody official was going to record them. The official forward unit would have its own record keepers. They had everything else. Dravik had died first, at Keswick, in a way that was fast and final and left her in charge of the unit by default because she was the only one who'd read the technical manuals and also the only one who could read the Sovereignty's tactical frequency codes, which turned out to matter more than rank. He'd been hard to work for, and she'd respected him anyway, which was the best you could say about most officers. Then Solon, then Fett, then Rika, who'd been 17 years old and too young for any of this, and who had died anyway because the war didn't check documentation. Then Martin, who she tried not to think about because thinking about Martin made the white fire seem almost welcome by comparison. And then there were 3 of them, and they kept moving, because stopping meant becoming part of the landscape. She rested at the 100-yard mark and looked up at the lander. From here she could see the maintenance hatches along the port hull. The 3rd one, the small one with the yellow and black, it was intact. The crash had crumpled the forward section and sheared off the landing struts, but the port hull was remarkably undamaged. The way crashes sometimes worked, random preservation in the midst of random destruction. She could also see, through a crack in the hull plating she hadn't been able to see from her starting point, the faint blue-green light of the drive core containment matrix. Still lit. Containment still active. 12 hours on the outside. She filed this away and began the second 100 yards. Somewhere around the 150-yard mark, she started to lose some time. Not dramatically. She didn't black out exactly, but there were gaps. She'd be pushing and counting, and then she'd be 3 feet further along with no memory of the transition, and she'd rest and try to account for the missing seconds and give up and push again. The concussion, she thought, or blood loss from the elbows, though she didn't think she was losing that much, or possibly just the body deciding that some portions of this experience were not worth filing. In one of the gaps, she was somewhere else entirely. She was at the base camp at Yenoth before the advance, when the unit was still 11 soldiers and the war was still a war. It was evening, and someone had found a bottle of something, and they were passing it around in the dark between the equipment crates, not speaking much. And Dravik was telling a story about his daughter's animal impression show with the particular combination of embarrassment and pride that fathers used when they thought no one was watching them feel things. The bottle came around to Gret, and she took a pull and passed it to Myra, who made a face at the taste and passed it on. And somewhere across the camp someone was playing an instrument badly, but with real enthusiasm. And the night smelled like wood smoke and the specific damp, cold of high altitude, and it was the last night before everything. She came back to the gravel and the debris field, and the weight of her own body and the white fire, and the 300 yards she still had to go. She pushed again. The debris field was worse than it had looked from a distance. There was a lot to navigate around and through. Hull plating, strut sections, cargo containers cracked open and spilled, the personal effects of the command crew distributed across the valley in a way that was comprehensively undignified. She tried not to look too closely at some of it and mostly succeeded. She crawled between 2 sections of hull plating that created a brief tunnel of shadow, and she rested there longer than she intended, pressing her face against the cool metal, letting it pull some of the heat from her head. She counted 30, and then counted another 30. She thought about the sovereignty. She'd had months to think about the sovereignty, and she'd done a great deal of it, and she'd arrived at some conclusions that she suspected were not the standard ones. The standard conclusion, the one that the official briefings pushed and the official soldiers accepted, was that the sovereignty was an alien force of aggressive conquest, implacably hostile, fundamentally incomprehensible. Leave it at that. Shoot it. Gret had read the manuals. The sovereignty had hierarchy problems. They had internal factions, competing priority systems, a command structure that rewarded certain kinds of performance and punished others, and a specific, systematic tendency to discount anything unofficial, anything that didn't appear in the right ledger, the right registry, the right chain of command. The official forces got the resources. The unofficial ones didn't count. She'd recognized this immediately because she'd been an unofficial one her whole life. Orc, female, unattached to any of the great military families, a supplemental force, off-record, expendable. There was something almost clarifying about being discounted by both sides. What it meant, practically, was that the sovereignty's command logic would not expect her here. Their assessment of this valley, if they'd made one, would account for the official forward unit, its last known position, its probable retreat vector, the assets it might have preserved. It would not account for an unofficial supplemental fighter dragging herself through the crash debris of one of their own landers. She was off the books. She kept moving. 270 yards, 30 to go. The maintenance hatch was above her, maybe 8 feet up the intact section of the port hull, and she lay on her back and looked at it and ran through the access sequence in her head. Panel opened counterclockwise, Sovereignty standard. Inside, the manual override console, 3 levers and a key plate. She didn't have the key. She had a combat knife with a blade profile that would serve if she applied the right angle and enough pressure, which she'd confirmed theoretically while reading the manuals, and had never confirmed practically, because the practical situation had not previously arisen. Getting up 8 feet was the problem. She'd known getting up 8 feet was going to be the problem since approximately the 100-yard mark, when she'd started running simulations in the parts of her brain that were still running simulations. The hull had damage points where the metal had buckled and warped, creating rough handholds. She'd spotted 2 from 30 yards out. If she could get herself to standing position, if the white fire permitted that, even briefly, she could climb. She spent 20 minutes getting herself to the base of the hull. She lay there and breathed. In one of the gaps she was back at Yenoth, but not at the evening with the bottle. This time she was standing outside the supply tent watching the resupply drones come down, their singular tracking lights in the pre-dawn dark, and she was counting the crates and doing the math. The official forward unit, 14 boxes. Her unit, 3. Food, ammunition, medical. She'd gone to the supply officer, and the supply officer had checked his manifest and confirmed the numbers with complete indifference. The way bureaucracies confirmed things. The way numbers became facts through the indifference of the people who held them. She'd looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, and then she'd taken her 3 crates and gone. She hadn't said anything. She'd thought about saying something, but saying something would have taken energy she needed for other purposes, and the supply officer would not have changed the manifest, and the war would have continued in exactly the same shape. She came back to the hull and the handholds in the white fire. She put her hands on the metal. She was not going to describe what the next 15 minutes were like, because there weren't words for it that she found useful. There was the white fire, and there was her own voice saying things under her breath that were partly instructions to herself and partly something older, something from the back of the throat, a sound her grandmother had made when working, a sound that women in her family made when doing things that needed doing regardless. Her vision went narrow and her arms shook, and she jammed her fingers into handholds and pulled, and several things in her body registered formal complaints which she noted and set aside. She got to the maintenance hatch. She had to hook one arm through a handhold and hang there while she got the knife out, and hanging there was a whole other category of white fire. But she got the knife out, and she got the blade into the panel seam, and the panel opened the way the manual said it would open. Inside was the manual override console, 3 levers silver gray, a key plate its slot dark. She put the knife blade into the key slot and applied the right angle and the right pressure. It took 4 minutes. She counted every second. The key plate lit amber, and she moved the first lever. The console's interface was not complicated, which she'd known from the manual. The Sovereignty designed their emergency systems for use under stress, for crew members potentially injured or panicked, and this meant simplified sequences and clear visual feedback. She had 8 steps to complete before the drive core would accept an override command. She completed them one at a time, stopping twice when the white fire got bad enough that she lost her grip and had to rehook her arm. The console asked her, in Sovereignty operational language, to confirm the override directive. She confirmed it. There was no immediate result. There wouldn't be. The drive core needed time to reconfigure its containment geometry. The manual had said 6 to 9 hours for a full directional release configuration. She just initiated that reconfiguration. In 6 to 9 hours, the drive core would be ready to discharge in a directed beam through the port hull, up through the valley's open sky, at whatever happened to be in that sky. She would not be alive to trigger it manually. She understood this. The release required a secondary confirmation that could only be entered at this console, and she was not going to be at this console in 6 to 9 hours. But the release could also be triggered remotely, by anything broadcasting on the Sovereignty's own emergency channel, like a rescue craft's landing transponder, like the tactical comms of a reinforcement unit descending through the atmosphere. When the Sovereignty came to collect their fallen lander, they would trigger it themselves. She'd thought of this at the 150-yard mark. She'd had 2 hours of crawling to confirm it made sense. She lowered herself back down the hull the way she'd come up, badly, and lay on the gravel of the valley floor and looked at the sky. The sun was nearly down. The valley was going purple and cold. Somewhere over the ridge still, what might be artillery or might be thunder. She rolled carefully onto her side and got the photograph out. It was a bad photograph, technically. Out of focus along one edge, the colors shifted toward yellow by whatever the developing process had done. 3 people standing in front of a door she recognized as the entrance to the training barracks at Yenoth before the advance. Dravik in the middle with his arms around Myra and herself, all 3 of them in worn training clothes, none of them looking at the camera because someone had taken it without warning. Dravik was mid-sentence. Myra was laughing at something off-frame. Gret was looking sideways at Dravik with an expression she couldn't entirely read from the outside, but which she thought, on reflection, was affection of the grudging kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She looked at it until the light was too low to see it clearly. Then she folded it and put it back against her sternum. Night came in stages. First the stars, scattered and indifferent. Then the temperature drop that she was prepared for and which was bad anyway. Then the particular quality of silence that large empty spaces produced in the dark. Not quiet exactly, but depopulated. The sound of wind moving through absence. Gret lay still in thought. The unit was scattered. Myra toward the creek, Vorlin up the eastern face. If either of them was alive, and she believed they were, not because she had evidence but because the alternative wasn't useful to sit with, they would be moving. Vorlin would climb until he found a vantage point, then assess. Myra would get the civilians to the secondary rally point at the old Brennan relay station, then contact whoever could be contacted. This was what they did. They had been doing it for months without resupply, without recognition, without support, and they had kept doing it because there was nothing else to do. The official forward unit would file a report about the lander coming down. It would probably not mention the unofficial supplemental force. It would probably not mention Gret at all. She found she did not care about this as much as she might have expected. There was a thing that happened sometimes when you'd been off the books long enough. You stopped needing to be on them. You stopped measuring your existence by the manifest. She'd watched it happen to Dravik, who'd started the campaign furious about the supply discrepancy and ended it simply working around it without comment. She'd watched it happen to Myra, who'd stopped filing official contact reports around the 3rd month and started simply doing the thing and moving on. She thought it might be happening to her, lying here in the dark with her broken ribs and her compromised spine and the photograph against her sternum. She existed whether the manifest said so or not. She'd done what she'd done. The drive core was configured. The Sovereignty would come and they would trigger it themselves, and it would not matter to the valley or the people in it whether Gret appeared in any record. This was not resignation. She was careful about the distinction. Resignation was the white flag, the letting go. What she felt was different, smaller and harder and less dramatic. More like recognizing that a thing had been true all along, and you'd just been arguing with it. She'd been arguing with it her whole life. The counting of crates, the checking of manifests, The looking at supply officers across the precise moment before you turned and walked away. She was tired of arguing with it. Around what she estimated was the 3rd hour of night, she heard movement in the debris field. She had the sidearm out and her thumb on the safety before the sound registered fully, because that was what the body did. The body made its decisions before the mind caught up. She held still and listened. Footsteps 2 sets. Careful, slow, navigating the debris with knowledge of where to step, which meant someone who'd come from the direction of the lander, not from the open valley. Someone who'd been through the wreckage before. Her. Or someone from inside the lander. She pressed herself as flat as she could and waited. The footsteps came closer. She had the sidearm aimed at the sound and her breathing as controlled as she could make it, and the white fire was there but quiet, as if it understood this was not the moment. Gret. Vorlin's voice, very low. She exhaled. Here, she said, equally low. The footsteps changed direction. She heard him navigate around a section of hull plating, and then he was there, crouching beside her in the dark, and she could smell the ash on him from whatever he'd done on the eastern face and see the shadow of him against the stars. I thought you were dead, he said. I'm working on it, she said. How's your arm? There was a pause. You can see that. I can hear you favoring it. Stop doing that, it puts your balance off. Another pause. He settled into a sitting position beside her carefully, the way you sat when something hurt. Myra got them through. I watched from the ridge. The official unit showed up at the relay station an hour after she arrived. A beat. They filed the evacuation under their own action. I know, Gret said. You know. I assumed. Silence for a moment. The wind moved through the debris. What did you do to the lander? He said. It wasn't entirely a question. I configured the drive core for directional release on emergency channel contact. The silence this time was longer. You crawled 400 yards, he said. 390. To rig their own emergency system, to kill their own rescue unit. Their own reinforcement unit, yes, when they come to collect the lander. Off the books, he said. Off the books, she agreed. He sat with this. The stars moved slowly through the black. Somewhere far away, over many ridges now, not just one, the artillery sound had stopped. She noticed this and filed it as potentially significant, and didn't have enough information to know what it signified. I can carry you, Vorlin said. No. Gret. You have a damaged arm. I have a spine problem. If you carry me and fall, we both become landscape. Then what do you want to do? She thought about it. The honest answer was that she'd been thinking about getting to the lander for so long that she hadn't thought much past it. The drive core was configured. That was a completed action. What came next was something different. I want to wait, she said. For what? For what happens? He was quiet for a long time. Then, I'm staying. She thought about arguing with this, and decided it wasn't worth the energy. Fine. I'm going to get your arm under my good one. Fine. He shifted beside her and got his arm around her shoulders, careful of the ribs, and she felt the warmth of him and let herself lean fractionally into it, the way she'd never let herself do when there were more of them, and pride was still a practical consideration. She was past pride. She'd crawled 390 yards through a debris field. Pride had been left behind somewhere around the 150-yard mark. Tell me something, Vorlin said. What? Tell me about the manuals, the sovereignty manuals, why you read them. She considered this, because I wanted to understand them. Most people just want to shoot them. Shooting them requires understanding them first. Nobody official was going to tell us how, so I found out myself. And what do you understand? She looked at the stars. They have the same problem we have. They decide who counts before they look at what's there, Everything unofficial gets subtracted from the equation, and then they're always surprised when something unofficial breaks their math. Vorlin was quiet. "I've been unofficial my entire life," she said. "It turns out that's actually useful. Nobody tracks you. Nobody accounts for you. You can be in places you're not supposed to be, doing things you're not supposed to do, and the official math never adjusts for you." She paused. "I adjusted for it." He didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Is that what you were thinking about while you were crawling?" "Among other things." "What else?" Dravik's story about his daughter. "The animal impressions." "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. The cold was serious now, the kind that came in off the high ground after midnight, and she could feel Vorlin shivering beside her and knew she was doing the same. "He told that story every time he had something to drink," Vorlin said. "I know. I heard it 7 times. 8, she said. "You were asleep for one of them." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She felt the photograph against her sternum and thought about showing him and decided not to. Not yet. It was still hers for now, that image of the 3 of them before Martin, before Rika, before all of it, the photograph of the unit when it was still a unit with all its pieces. She'd show him something else. "When this is over," she said, "I want to learn to play an instrument." "You're terrible at music." "Badly but with enthusiasm," she said. "That seems like enough." Dawn came gray and cold, and brought with it the sound of engines. She'd slept in fragments, less unconscious than the body going briefly offline to do maintenance, and each time she came back Vorlin was still there, and the gravel was still cold, and the stars were still where the stars had always been. When the gray began she was awake and watching the horizon. The engines came from the south. High up, the kind of altitude that sovereignty reinforcement carriers used when they were being cautious. She counted 3 distinct engine signatures, then a 4th. A full recovery team then, not just a scouting pass. Vorlin had heard it too. She could feel the change in his posture. "How long?" he said. "Until they're in range of the valley. 30 minutes maybe, less if they push their descent." "And the drive core?" "Configured and waiting." He was quiet, processing. Then, "We should move, clear of the lander, in case the discharge isn't as directional as you think." "It will be," she said. "The manual was specific." "Manuals are written by people who weren't crashed into a valley." He had a point. She acknowledged this with the particular silence she used for acknowledging things that were correct. "You'll have to help me," she said. "I know." It took them 20 minutes to get far enough from the lander to satisfy Vorlin. He did most of the work with his good arm, and she did what she could with her elbows and her left leg, and somewhere in that 20 minutes, she crossed a threshold she hadn't expected, where the pain was still there. But she'd been in it long enough that it had become background rather than foreground, the ambient texture of the world rather than the thing that filled all available space. She didn't know if this was adaptation or damage. She decided it didn't matter which. They settled against a section of exposed rock, half-sheltered, with a clear view of the valley and the sky above it and the intact port hull of the lander. She could see the maintenance hatch from here, still closed. The amber light of the key plate was faintly visible even in growing daylight. The engine sounds grew. She thought about all the things she hadn't been given. The resupply crates, the armor upgrades, the official designation, the recognition, the record. She thought about the supply manifest with her unit's numbers, the 3 boxes, the indifferent face of the supply officer who had confirmed them. She thought about all the ways the accounting had tried to establish her worth, and what the accounting had come up with, and what she had come up with instead. She thought about being off the books, off the manifest, off the radar of anyone who tracked assets and assigned values and decided what counted. She was about to prove, very definitively, that she counted. Not because anyone would put it in a record, Not because the official report would mention her, not because the supply manifest would be amended retroactively to reflect what she'd accomplished. None of that was going to happen. She'd be wrong to expect it, and she'd been wrong to want it for as long as she had. She would count because the drive core was configured and the sovereignty reinforcements were coming, and when they transmitted their landing transponders, their own emergency channel would do the rest. She counted because it was true, and because it had always been true, and because the only thing that had ever suggested otherwise was other people's accounting. The engine sounds were very close now. She could see the shapes against the brightening sky, 4 carriers, holding in high orbit above the valley, their formation lights like new stars. She watched them begin their descent approach, slow and deliberate, the way trained pilots moved over a crash site they hadn't verified. Vorlin's hand found hers. She let it. "I'm going to write this down," he said, after. "I know," she said. "The whole thing, all of it, Keswick, the supply manifests, Rika, Martin, what you did here. It won't change the official record." "No," he agreed, "but there will be another record. For whoever finds it." She thought about the last thing she'd said to Myra, brief and practical, before the lander came down. She thought about what she would want to be in a record if she was allowed to choose. Not the heroics, she mistrusted heroics as a category, found them too clean, too arranged. What she'd want was the specific details, the smell of the lamp at Yenoth, the taste of what was in that bottle, the way Dravik's voice changed when he told the story about his daughter. The line of insects 6 inches from her tusks, while she pressed her face into the gravel and breathed. The things that made it real instead of arranged. "Put in the lamp," she said. "What?" "When you write it down, put in the lamp at Yenoth, the way it smelled." He looked at her. In the growing light, she could see the dried blood on his arm and the exhaustion in his face. And under that something that might have been the thing Myra would have called feeling and Vorlin would have called insufficient data. "I'll put in the lamp," he said. The first carrier began its final descent approach. She could see its landing transponder light now, strobing blue-white, transmitting on all emergency frequencies as doctrine required. Transmitting on the Sovereignty Emergency Channel. She let her head rest on Vorlin's shoulder and looked at the sky. The port hull of the lander was very bright for a moment. Then the brightness went up. They found shelter in the base of the ridge, while the valley sorted itself out. The discharge was directional, as the manual had specified. She'd noted Vorlin's expression when this proved correct, and she'd allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The carriers had not been close enough to the ground to prevent their evasive response, but the discharge had damaged the lead carrier's drive system severely enough that it would need repair time before it could safely land anywhere. The recovery mission was aborted. The valley was clear. By midday, Myra came back from the direction of the relay station with 2 of the civilians who'd insisted on returning, an older man and a teenager who decided independently that waiting was worse than moving. She'd argued with them and then given up and brought them along because that was also what Myra did. She came around a section of hull plating and stopped. "I thought you were dead," she said. "People keep saying that," Gret said. Myra looked at Vorlin. Vorlin shrugged with his good shoulder. Myra looked back at Gret, at the field dressings she'd applied to herself around the 2nd hour of night, at the position she was maintaining against the rock, and then she sat down and was quiet for a moment, and then she said in a lower voice, "How bad?" "Manageable," Gret said. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." Myra pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was choosing not to respond to something. The teenager had come around the hull section and was staring at the debris field, and the scorch marks on the valley floor, and the distant smudge in the sky. That was all that was visible of the damaged carrier's repair burn. The older man had sat down on a cargo container, and was looking at his hands with the particular expression of someone recently through something large. "We need to move," Vorlon said. "The secondary rally point at Brennan, and then wherever comes after that." "The official unit is at Brennan," Myra said. "They filed." "I know what they filed," Gret said. Myra looked at her. "We'll figure out Brennan when we get to Brennan," Gret said. "There's always something to figure out." A pause. Then Myra nodded. Once, the precise nod she used for decisions she had reservations about but was choosing not to fight. Vorlon and Myra built a carry frame from 2 sections of hull strut and Gret's field kit. It was inelegant, and it would hurt, and she was not going to say any of this out loud. The older man helped without being asked, fitting the strut sections together with the quiet competence of someone who worked with his hands. The teenager watched and then held the frame steady while Vorlon lashed it. "What's your name?" Gret asked him. The teenager looked up. "Sevi." "How long have you been with the column, Sevi?" "Since Keswick." She looked at him. 17, maybe, possibly 18. Young enough that the math still felt unfair, old enough that he'd already accepted it. He held the frame with careful hands and didn't flinch from her gaze. "You know how to read sovereignty, operational language?" A flicker of surprise. "No." "I'll teach you," she said. "While we move, it's useful." A pause. "Knowing what they're doing is the first step to doing something about it." He absorbed this, then carefully, "Okay." She let them lift her onto the carry frame. It was as bad as she'd expected, and she said nothing about it and concentrated on the sky. The same sky she'd been staring at since she'd stopped being able to walk, which had at some point transformed from the ceiling of her failure into simply the sky. The same sky it had always been, indifferent and enormous and full of the kind of light that didn't care about manifests. They moved out of the valley in the direction of Brennan. She watched the ridgeline above them as they walked. Vorlon's launcher mark was still visible on the eastern face, a long dark scar where the shot had gone in. She looked at it until the valley floor curved enough to take it out of view. 400 yards, 3 hours, then another 3 hours lying still with Vorlon's arm around her, waiting for dawn. Then the carriers and the discharge and whatever came after that. She'd crawled 400 yards. She'd read the manuals. She'd been off the books her whole life, and she'd figured out how to make that work eventually. She'd write a manual of her own, she decided, not for anyone official. For whoever came after, whoever would be handed 3 boxes instead of 14, whoever would look at the supply officer's face and turn away. She'd write down everything she knew about being the supplemental force that the official force forgot to account for, about being the unofficial unit that changed the math anyway. She'd put in the lamp at Yenoth, the smell of it, the bottle passing around in the dark, Dravik's voice when he talked about his daughter. She'd put in the line of insect 6 inches from her tusks. The things that made it real. They cleared the valley and took the high path north, and the sky opened up wide in all directions, and she felt the wind come down off the ridge with the cold in it that meant altitude and distance and space still left to move through. And somewhere in that wind was the smell of rain coming, real rain, the kind that didn't care what the manifest said. She pressed her hand against the photograph, against her sternum. She thought later. She thought there's still more to write. Months later, in a relay station that had been captured and recaptured 4 times and now belonged definitively to no one, Vorlon found the notebook. He'd been looking for a different notebook, his own, which he'd left in the corner of the room while he went to meet with the officer from the official garrison, a young human woman who'd been trying to integrate the supplemental forces into the official chain of command, in a way that kept running into the problem that the supplemental forces didn't have official records. He'd come back to find the notebook was where he'd left it, but someone had added pages. He sat and read them. The handwriting was Gret's, he'd know it anywhere, the particular forward slant she used, the way she made her 7s. There were 12 pages. They started with the line of insects 6 inches from her tusks, and they went backward from there. Keswick, Yenoth, the supply manifest, the lamp. The smell of the lamp. Dravik's story about his daughter. The bottle passing in the dark. Everything specific and particular and unrefined. The texture of the thing rather than the arranged version of it. The last page ended in the middle of a paragraph about the Carey frame. Below the last sentence she'd written something else, separately, in smaller letters, the kind of writing you did when you were adding something that felt necessary but separate from the rest. It said, "If you find this, keep going. The math is wrong. You know it's wrong, you've always known. That's not the same as giving up. That's called being correct. The unofficial ones are everywhere. We've always been everywhere. We're just not in the ledger. The ledger is wrong." Vorlon sat with this for a long time. He got his own notebook out. He added Gret's pages to it carefully. He wrote a short paragraph at the beginning that said who she was and what she'd done, and included the part about the insects because she'd told him to. Then he put the notebook in his inside pocket and went back to the meeting with the officer from the official garrison to continue the long, slow, impractical project of making the ledger less wrong. Outside the relay station, somewhere on the high path, rain came down in the way it came down when it didn't care about anything except falling.